New Mexico Territory, late summer of 1879. The sun was just starting to dip behind the dust-covered hills, casting long shadows across the high plains. The wind stirred the red dirt on the road, lifting it into small swirls that danced over old wagon ruts and dry grass. The fierce heat of the day had finally broken, but the air still clung to the skin like a worn-out coat. Silas Thorne stood on the porch of his isolated home, a small, sturdy cabin attached to a stone forge. His boots were planted firm, his arms crossed as he watched the wind settle. He had been fixing the hinges on the barn door when he heard it. A knock. It was not loud, just enough to be certain it wasn't the wind or a branch. He turned his head slowly, his movements deliberate, dot at the edge of his porch. Standing as if she might collapse at any moment was a girl. She was 19, maybe 20, skinny as a fence rail, her boots nearly worn through to the soles. A thin shawl, so worn its fringe blew like spiderwebs in the breeze, was clutched around her shoulders. In her hands she held a heavy cast-iron pot, as if it were a shield made of gold. She did not smile. She did not beg. Her voice, when she spoke, cracked with thirst, but her eyes held his, steady and unwavering. "I don't talk much, mister," she said. "But I can cook." Silas said nothing. He was a blacksmith, a man of fire and iron, and his silence was as much a part of him as the soot under his fingernails. He studied her. He saw the way her lips were chapped, how her knees trembled but never buckled. He saw how her hands were blistered from walking, yet still gripped that heavy pot like it was the last piece of her old life she had left. His brow furrowed, the deep lines on his face etched by a sun and a sorrow that had long since burned away any softness. "Name?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "Clara," she said, soft as a prayer. He looked past her down the long, empty trail. There was no wagon, no mule, nothing but the dust and the setting sun. "You got folks?" She shook her head once, a small, sharp movement. He looked down at her bare fingers holding the handle of the pot. The rim had soot baked into it, a dark ring that told a story of more campfires than proper kitchens. For a long, heavy breath, nothing passed between them but the silence and the creak of wood in the wind. Then he stepped aside from the doorway. "You're hired," he said. He then added, his voice so quiet it sounded almost like surrender, "And you're home." Clara's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but like someone finally laying down a weight they had carried too far. She stepped forward, her worn boots barely making a sound on the wooden porch. He did not take her hand. He did not ask any more questions. She passed him, her eyes scanning the porch, the door, the dark corners. She walked into the house like someone tiptoeing into a memory that wasn't hers. Inside, the place was clean, but cold, not with temperature, but with emptiness. The furniture was sparse and handmade. A kettle sat rusting on the back burner of the stove. The great stone hearth of the forge, visible through an adjoining door, was swept but untouched. She paused in the doorway, turning slightly. "Where should I sleep?" Silas pointed to a small back room. "There's a cot. The sheets are clean. Water's in the basin." He turned back to the door. "Tomorrow we'll talk chores. Tonight you eat." She nodded once and disappeared. Down the short hall, Silas stood alone on the porch a while longer as the sun finally vanished, leaving the sky a bruised purple. He looked out across his land-dry fields, a few chickens, a half-collapsed barn, and a silence that had lasted for 6 long winters. Then he turned, went inside, and shut the door behind him. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't lock it. The scent of bread was always the first thing Clara remembered about her childhood. It was a warm, thick, and hopeful smell, rising through the cracks in the floorboards from her father's bakery below. Her father's hands were always covered. in flour and faint burns from the ovens. Her mother stitched aprons and hummed songs in a language Clara never learned the name of. They were poor, but they were together. That life had burned down with the rest of the town in the great fire of Off. 73. She was 13 when she watched her father pull her mother's body from the embers of their home. After that, her father's spirit had turned to ash as well. He had taken a job in the mines to pay off their debts, and a collapse 2 years later had taken what was left of him. At 15, Clara was alone. She tried to hold on, baking bread for the miners, but a woman wasn't allowed to own a business without a man's name on the deed. The mine boss, a man named Cyrus Elwood, let her stay for a time, a supposed kindness that soon revealed its true price. He began locking the back door at night and lingering too long when she bent over the hearth. She left one night with new bruises under her collar and the cast-iron pot her mother had once used to stew blackberries. It was all she had left. She walked east, begging in silence, offering to cook for board. In one town, an innkeeper let her wash dishes, but on the third night, he opened her door without knocking. She broke his nose with a heavy ladle and ran before dawn. 3 towns, 4 days. Snow in her sleeves, blisters on her feet. She slept in haylofts and under wagons. By the time she saw the wooden gate of Silas Thorne's forge at the edge of nowhere, her lips were split, and her belly had forgotten the memory of warm food. Now, waking in the small, dark room, the first thing she noticed was the quiet. It was a different quiet from the wilderness. It was a heavy, settled silence, the kind that comes from a long and profound grief. The room was sparse. A cot, a chair, a small washstand, a single faded dress hung on a peg on the wall. The air carried the faintest trace of lavender, long, faded, but stubborn in its persistence. This had been her room. Clara stood in the silence for a long time, running her hand gently along the dresser's edge, careful not to shift anything. Then she walked to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to let in a sliver of pale morning light. She had not been stolen from, she realized. She had been saved. When she stepped into the main room, she found a bundle of kindling and 2 fresh eggs resting on the bench just outside her door. No note, no knock. Just a silent offering from a man who did not know how to say welcome. She took them and moved into the kitchen, then stopped. It was colder than she expected. The hearth, the heart of any home, had long gone cold. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The stovetop wore a coat of soft gray ash, as though the last fire had died quietly one night, and no one had had the heart to wake it again. Pans rested on their hooks. A tin of dried herbs, unopened, sat on a dusty shelf. She picked it up. Rosemary. Someone had loved this place once, then had simply left it behind. She rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and found a rag. She boiled water, then scrubbed the counters until the dark grain of the wood showed through again. She opened every window, letting in the pale morning air. The wind was sharp, but it smelled clean. It felt like exhuming a memory. She found a chipped blue bowl tucked in the back of a cupboard, washed it twice, then cracked the eggs into it. Her hands shook, but the rhythm of whisking settled her. She added salt from a nearly full jar, chopped a wild onion finely, and moved like someone who had always known how to work with fire and hunger. As the scent of eggs and heat began to fill the cold air, she reached up and rehung a sun-bleached curtain that had fallen from its hook. A triangle of golden light spilled across the old wooden floor, catching on something tucked between 2 books on a shelf. A photograph, worn and soft at the edges. A woman with kind, dark eyes and a boy smiling shyly beside her. Silas's wife. His son. Clara stared at it for a long while, then bowed her head. "I'll take good care of it," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she meant the photograph, the house, or the profound silence that still clung to its bones. Perhaps all three. The snow had softened outside, the wind dying into a hush that let the small homestead breathe again. Inside, the air was warming, not just with the fire Clara had coaxed back to life, but with something unfamiliar, a scent that had not visited these walls in years. It was the scent of a home. Chicken bones simmered gently in her cast-iron pot, rosemary from the dusty tin weaving its subtle, earthy promise through the rising steam, and the faint sweetness of fresh cornbread cooling by the hearth. Clara stood by the stove, careful not to spill a drop as she ladled the chicken soup into a deep ceramic bowl, one she had found and washed. The broth shimmered golden in the lantern light, filled with tender carrot rounds, cubed potatoes, and a whisper of that forgotten rosemary. It was a recipe passed down from her mother, learned by heart around crackling stoves. Beside the bowl, she placed a thick slice of the cornbread, its edges brown just enough to break with a soft crunch. She ran her fingers over the crust, remembering the way her mother used to gently pat down the batter before baking, humming wordless melodies. That felt like sunlight itself. She carried the plate to the table and stepped back. Silas was already seated, his rough, calloused hands folded on his lap, his eyes unreadable in the dim kitchen light. He watched the food with a quiet, unnerving intensity, as though he was tasting something far beyond mere flavor. Clara offered a quiet nod, her voice soft like the falling snow outside. "It is nothing fancy, just a simple farm meal." He did not reply. Instead, he reached for the spoon and dipped it into the soup. The room fell into a silence thicker than the steam, rising from the bowl. All she could hear was the slow, deliberate scrape of metal against ceramic, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, and the subtle crackle of the hearth fire. Each moment stretched longer than the one before. She stood stiffly, her hands clasped. In front of her, waiting, not for praise, but for a sign, for permission to believe that this, her simple offering, was enough. Silas finished half the bowl before setting the spoon down with careful precision. He drew a deep breath, as if tasting the words before letting them out. "The cornbread," he said, his voice low and measured. "It's the kind that holds together." Clara's shoulders eased as she nodded. "Cornmeal and lard. No eggs. It was my mother's trick for when the hens wouldn't lay." He listened, his eyes on the bowl, before he shifted it slightly toward her. "Good soup," he said. Her heart lifted, a small, fragile thing, but her voice remained small. "Thank you." He rose then, putting his spoon back into the bowl, and stepped outside into the cold, the screen door slamming softly behind him. Ellie exhaled, her shoulders slumping as the tension finally left her body. She turned back toward the sink, carrying the bowl, still braced as though waiting for the moment he would change his mind. But she felt something settle inside her instead, something that felt a little like hope. Later that night, she made her way through the quiet kitchen, a candle in one hand and a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. On impulse, she paused at the threshold of the main room, sensing rather than seeing him. Silas stood by the window, barely moving. His figure was outlined against the dark pane, the faint reflection of the hearth fire behind him. His arms were folded across his chest, silent and steady. From where she stood, she could feel the weight of his gaze, not on the night sky, but on the kitchen itself. The pot still sat on the stove, its warmth spilling into the darkness. The aroma of rosemary lingered in the air, sweet and earthy. He did not see her standing there, but Clara saw everything. The way his jaw was firm, the way his shoulders had relaxed just a little since she had arrived. This was not a man who was distrustful of her cooking or her hands. He was a man who had not allowed anything to get close to him in many years. A man who had built walls of silence, brick by careful brick, to shield himself from the world's betrayals. And now, she realized, he feared that to enjoy something as simple as a hot bowl of soup, a warm slice of cornbread, a quiet kitchen filled with ordinary life, was to risk remembering what he had lost. She swallowed, her eyes fixed on his reflection. She whispered into the gloom, her words barely louder than a breath. "You can trust the small things, Silas, just the small things." Behind her, the fire did not die. It crackled gently, a promise that some warmth could return, and that some losses could be healed, one quiet meal at a time. The night sky unfolded wide and clear over the plains, the stars pricking the velvet dark like someone had stitched light into the heavens. The wind was soft for once, curling around the porch like an old dog settling at their feet. Clara sat on the top step, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her knees pulled up to her chest. Silas sat beside her, his boots planted firm on the ground, his hat tipped low to keep the chill off his ears. They had eaten supper in their usual silence: roasted turnips, leftover stew, and slices of cornbread from the morning batch. Now they sat together, not talking, not needing to. The quiet was not awkward. It was full. It was the kind of silence that held space like a blanket between them, warm and protective. After a while, Clara broke it, her voice gentle. "My mama once burned a whole tray of biscuits," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant, dark horizon. "She left them in the oven too long while she was telling me a story about how my papa had asked her to marry him." Silas tilted his head, his eyes still on the sky. "We didn't have much that day," she continued. She was so mad at herself, crying and cursing up a storm. "But my papa just took one of the burnt biscuits, said, 'Burned love is still love, as long as it's warm.' And he ate the whole thing." A quiet, breathy laugh escaped her lips. "I laughed so hard I nearly choked. Then Mama started laughing too. She always did get madder at herself than at anyone else." Silas's lips quirked at the corners. Then, barely, he chuckled. It was a soft, short, rusty sound, but it was real. It was the first time Clara had ever heard him laugh. She turned slightly, stealing a glance at his face. In the starlight, he looked gentler than usual, the shadows kinder to the harsh lines etched there. She did not say anything more, just let the shared moment sit there between them. When the night deepened and they stood to go inside, Silas paused. By the door. "I'll fix the dining room table tomorrow," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara blinked, surprised. "Why? We eat in the kitchen." He shrugged once, his broad shoulders moving under his worn shirt. "You need a proper space to roll out your dough. That old sideboard is too narrow." Clara nodded, her heart catching a little in her throat. "Thank you," she said. The next morning, before sunrise, she found him in the dining room, sleeves rolled up, sanding the edge of the long neglected oak table. The surface had warped over the years, bent and scarred from heat and spills and time. He worked quietly, methodically, his large hands moving with a patient care, smoothing the old wood. She stood in the doorway, watching him. "You don't need to do this," she said. He kept sanding. "You don't ask for much." He replied, his voice a little rough. "Just seems right." That afternoon, she baked again. This time it was sweet rolls, light and golden, brushed with honey from a jar he had traded for in town months ago and never opened. When she brought him one in the forge, he took it in his calloused hand and bit into it without a word. But when he looked at her for just a moment, just a single glance, she saw that something profound had shifted between them. Not much, but something. A week later, she found a new rolling pin on the kitchen shelf. Not new, really, but newly carved from a smooth piece of oak, shaped by hand. It fit her grip perfectly. There was no note, no mention of it, but she knew. And she whispered into the flour that morning, "Some men love louder without words." And the dough rose just fine. The day had been long and dry. Clara had spent the morning kneading bread, and the afternoon hanging wet linens across the fence. The wind tugged at them like restless hands, and she could feel a storm building in the west, though the sky still remained a deceptive, cloudless blue. By sundown, she was in the kitchen, dusting flour from her apron, when the knock came. Not on the front door, on the side gate. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wooden post. Then silence. Silas was still out in the pasture, checking on a newborn calf. Clara stepped out onto the back porch cautiously, a dish rag in her hand, her heart thudding with the familiar rhythm of unease. A man stood at the gate. He was tall, lean, with a crooked smile that held no kindness at all. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice a lazy drawl. "Ain't this a surprise?" Clara froze. His name was Marcus. He had lived 2 rooms down from her in the boarding house back in Junction Hollow, one of the towns she had fled through on her long journey west. He had never touched her, but he had looked. He had spoken too sweet, his words like sticky honey, and he had always smelled of sweat and sour whiskey. He had offered her things she never asked for, and had turned cruel when she refused. "I was just passing through," said now, his eyes scanning the yard, the porch, the neat stacks of firewood. "Saw the smoke from the chimney. Thought maybe someone here had a plate to spare. Didn't think I'd find you, of all people." Clara gripped the rag tighter. "Thought you was gone for good," he said, his gaze lingering on the house behind her. "But look at this. Fresh laundry, a working well, and a clean dress. You must be doing all right for yourself." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "You still cooking?" he asked. "I remember that stew you made for the old widow." On the second floor, smelled like a Sunday supper. Silas leaned in slightly over the gate, his tone dropping lower. "Funny you never said goodbye when you left. I thought we were friends." Clara took a step back, and then she heard it, the firm, purposeful sound of Silas's bootsteps. He had returned from the pasture, moving silently, as if the land itself had warned him. His shirt was damp with sweat, one glove half pulled off. His eyes locked on Marcus. He did not speak for a moment. He just moved to stand beside Clara. Then he did something she would never forget. Without a word, without even looking at her, he placed his large, steadying hand on her shoulder. It was a small, simple gesture, but it said everything. It said, "You are not alone." "He will have to go through me, Dot." When Silas finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but as solid as the anvil in his forge. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "She works here. She belongs here." Marcus blinked, the false charm on his face flickering, then vanishing completely. "Well, now, I didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered, backing up a step from the gate, "just passing through." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was now hurried and nervous. "Good luck to you, Miss Clara." And he turned and walked off quickly into the dust. Clara stood still, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Silas said nothing more. He did not tighten his grip, did not look down at her. He just kept his hand there for a few seconds longer, a silent, protective wait, then let it go and stepped back, giving her space. She turned to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't owe me thanks," he replied. A good cook deserves a safe kitchen. But his eyes said more than that. Later that night, after supper, Clara stood by the window and watched the horizon, wondering if Marcus had really gone, if he had said anything to anyone, if he would come back. Silas was in his workshop, the rhythmic sound of his hammer on steel a comforting, steady presence. But when she walked into the kitchen the next morning, she found a new, heavy iron lock bolted to the inside of the back door. She touched the cool, solid metal and knew, without needing to ask, that Silas had put it there in the dead of night. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her without demand, without condition, just because she was there, just because she mattered. And that, she was beginning to realize, made all the difference in the world. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, painting the wooden floor in ribbons of gold. Clara stood barefoot by the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her fingers dusted with flour. The dough was ready, soft and rich with buttermilk and butter, and the old tin biscuit cutter waited by her side. Behind her, Silas lingered near the door, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You said you never learned to bake," she said without turning around. "I didn't," he admitted. "Was always more skilled at burning things than browning them." She smiled and patted the dough. "Then today we fix that." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, awkwardly pulling up a chair beside her at the long table. Clara guided him through each step, her voice calm and patient. "Cut, press, fold. Don't overwork it. The butter needs to stay cold." Silas listened closely, trying to follow her every motion, but his large, calloused hands were clumsy with the delicate work. One biscuit came out lopsided, another too thin. She laughed. Not a cruel or mocking laugh, but a warm, genuine sound that seemed to fill the quiet room. "That one looks like Kansas after the floods," she teased gently. He looked at his lopsided creation, tilted his head, and chuckled under his breath. "Still better than the last one." "Progress," she said, her eyes gleaming. The oven warmed the room, and soon the scent of baking filled the air, rich, buttery, and slightly sweet. It wrapped around them like a memory of a home neither of them had had in a very long time. They sat side by side as the biscuits browned, talking about nothing much. Clara told him about her mother's old apron, how it had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt. Silas told her about his first horse, a stubborn Murray named June, who had refused to go anywhere without a carrot. "Do you still have that apron?" he asked, glancing at her quietly. Clara looked down at her own clean, simple apron. "No," she said. "It was one of the things I had to leave behind." He nodded and said nothing more. When the biscuits were ready, she pulled them from the oven and placed them on a cloth to cool. Silas reached for one before it was cool, burning his fingers. "Hot," he muttered, jerking his hand back. "I told you," she said, laughing again. He blew on the biscuit and tried again. This time, he managed to take a bite. His face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for her to notice. "It's good," he said, as if surprised. "Of course it is," she said with mock offense. "What did you think I've been feeding you all these weeks?" He chewed for a moment longer, then said, his voice thoughtful, "This one's different." Clara paused. "How so?" "It tastes like something new," he replied, struggling for the words. "Not just food, like the start of something. I don't know." Clara blushed and looked down at her flour-dusted hands. The next morning, she came into the kitchen expecting the usual firewood stacked, eggs on the counter, maybe a small jar of preserves. But something else waited for her. A small, carefully wrapped bundle sat neatly at the center of the table. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a new apron, made of sturdy blue canvas, with deep pockets and leather straps, the kind a blacksmith would use. There was no note. No name. Silas came in a minute later, his boots heavy on the floor. He didn't say anything at first, just walked to the sink and washed his hands. Then, as he dried them, he nodded toward the apron. "For the kitchen," he said simply, "so you don't keep ruining your dresses." Clara turned to him, her fingers brushing the sturdy canvas. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then went back outside. Later that day, she found herself humming while she kneaded dough. The song was something her mother used to sing when she thought no one was listening. Clara hadn't thought of it in years, but now it rose to her lips without effort. And in that simple, quiet kitchen, surrounded by the scent of baking biscuits and the gift of a new apron, a smile bloomed that neither of them had worn in a very long time. Spring returned to the high plains, gentle and full of color. The wild flowers came first, scattered tufts of purple and yellow across the ridge, and then the grass, green and forgiving after a long, wind-bitten winter. The homestead, once so quiet it felt haunted, now hummed with a simple, productive rhythm. The fences were mended, the soil was tilled, and the scent of biscuits rose from the chimney before sunrise. The kitchen had changed the most. It was no longer just a place to eat. It was alive with conversation, with quiet laughter, and with smells that made even the coldest mornings feel warm. Clara May stood by the window, her hands still dusted with flour, and watched Silas across the yard as he hammered a new beam into the porch rail. His shirt clung to his back, streaked with sweat and sawdust. She smiled faintly. Then her smile faded. A letter sat folded on the table behind her. An offer. The mayor's wife from the town of Redemption had come by last week. She had tasted Clara's peach cobbler and had declared it was better than anything this side of the Mississippi. She had a storefront that had recently become available, a small, clean kitchen in need of a baker. It was a chance for Clara to start her own shop, to have her own name above the door. Clara's kitchen. She had never had that. She had never had much of anything that was truly hers, except for a cast-iron pot and a history of running. And yet she baked one last loaf of bread before dusk, a golden-crusted sourdough, her mother's recipe. That evening she found Silas on the porch, gazing out over the fields as the sun set. She sat beside him, placed the warm loaf between them, and spoke quietly. "I was thinking I might go," she said, her voice steady. "The town has a kitchen with my name on it waiting. A proper stove. Real customers." Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the loaf of bread, then at her. "You should," he said, his voice flat. "If that's where your heart's leaning." Clara swallowed. "It's not about my heart. It's about not missing a chance to have something that's mine." "I understand," he said. He stood then and stepped off the porch, walking back into the dark interior of the house without another word. She sat there alone for a long time, the bread untouched, the night suddenly feeling colder than it had all week. The next morning, just after sunrise, Silas stood in the barn, tying up bundles of rope, when he heard footsteps behind him. Clara's voice came, soft but certain. "I made it to the edge of town," she said. He turned. She stood there, still in her apron, a warm loaf of bread tucked beneath one arm, a travel sack nowhere to be seen. "But when I saw the sun hit that high ridge," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "the same one I see from the kitchen window, I just couldn't go." Silas took a step toward her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not leaving," she said, holding out the loaf to him. "Not unless you fire me." Silas looked at her for a long, silent moment. Neither of them moved. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in an old, soft cloth, a cloth worn thin from years of being kept close. He unfolded it. It was a simple silver ring, modest and scuffed with age, but clean and whole. He placed it in her flour-streaked hand. "Then you're not just hired," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "You're home." Clara blinked quickly, her fingers closing around the worn silver. "I hope you like biscuits every day," she whispered. He smiled, a real unguarded smile that transformed his weathered face. "As long as they come with you." The sun rose higher, casting a warm golden light over the homestead, over the old fence, the thriving garden, and the kitchen window with its patched but clean curtains. Birds chirped in the distance. Somewhere, the windmill he had recently repaired creaked softly. Inside the kitchen, the fire crackled, a steady, comforting sound. 2 mugs of coffee waited on the table, and beside them, a single wildflower in a mason jar. It was not a grand proposal. There were no candles, no music, no lace. But it was love, as sure and as solid as the anvil in his forge. It was a love shaped like a warm loaf of bread, a simple silver ring, and a place by the fire. It was a love built not on words, but on the quiet, steady work of 2 people choosing to stay. In the months that followed, the homestead flourished. The small, quiet rhythm they had established deepened into a life. They worked side by side, their movements a familiar, comfortable dance. He would mend the tools, and she would mend his clothes. He would work the forge, and she would work the garden. They were 2 halves of a whole, each making the other stronger. The kitchen, once a cold and empty space, became the heart of their home. It was always warm now, always filled with the scent of baking bread, simmering stew, or drying herbs. The silence that had once defined their relationship was now filled with easy conversation, with quiet laughter, and with the simple, profound comfort of another person's presence. They were married by the circuit judge in the fall, not in a stuffy courtroom, but on the porch of their own home, with the vast, open plains as their witness. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, and Silas wore a clean shirt, his hands scrubbed, but still bearing the proud marks of his trade. There were no guests, no celebration, just the 2 of them and the quiet, solemn vows they made to each other. That winter, as the first snow fell, they sat by the fire, the silver ring warm on Clara's finger. She was knitting something small and soft from a ball of wool he had traded for in town. He was carving a small wooden horse, his knife moving with a practiced, gentle skill. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The road? The gambling?" He looked up from his carving, his eyes finding hers across the firelight. "Sometimes I miss the idea of it," he admitted. The idea that there was always something new over the next hill. He paused, then looked around the small, warm cabin. "But I've learned that sometimes the best discoveries are the ones you find when you finally decide to stay put." She smiled, a soft, contented smile. "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," he said, his voice a low, heartfelt whisper. Fire crackled, the knitting needles clicked, and the small wooden horse in his hands slowly took shape. It was not a grand life. It was a simple one. But it was a life they had built together, a life forged in the quiet spaces between hardship and hope. It was a life that was more than enough. It was joy. And as the snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a quiet, peaceful white, Silas Thorne knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was finally, truly home.